Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Every Man's Thoughts. In today's video, we're going to break down Episode 8, the finale for Season 1 of Rings of Power. Word of warning, there are significant spoilers ahead, so if you haven't seen Episode 8 yet, please hit that subscribe button and come back later. With that, you've been warned, so let's get started. Let's begin with Galadriel and Halbrand, as that's the meat of the story and what I think most people are interested in. When we last left off, Halbrand was suffering from a mortal wound from the battle in the Southlands. His wounds being beyond that of the local healers, Galadriel decided to ride for Eregion. One of the continuing problems with this show is they struggle with the vastness of Tolkien's world with time and distance. We've seen it in almost every episode. Think about this for a second. We're led to believe Halbrand took a lance to the chest. He's on death's doorstep, almost certainly has some form of internal bleeding. Yet, according to Galadriel, he rode full speed on horseback for 6 days and still survived. You don't have to be an expert horseman to know this is ridiculous. Every stitch would be torn, every wound ripped open and bleeding profusely. It's the sum total of all these little things that repeatedly break the spell and pull you out of the show. Keep in mind, Halbrand is an original character. He doesn't have to be wounded at all. This is a problem they walked into voluntarily. As we move along, Halbrand recovers almost immediately, only to discover Celebrimbor is still wrestling with how to save the elves with his minuscule amount of mithril. Halbrand, being a practiced smith, tells Celebrimbor to mix his mithril with other metals, making it an alloy and solving his scarcity problem. This is where Episode 8, called Alloyed, gets its name. When Celebrimbor is intrigued by this idea, Halbrand says consider it a gift. This is a direct reference to the original lore from the books. It's when Celebrimbor is explaining his plan to the High King that Galadriel gets her first inclination of Halbrand's true identity. Celebrimbor uses some of the exact same verbiage to describe his plan as Adar used previously to describe Sauron's magic. As Celebrimbor and Halbrand work to solve the problem, Galadriel's suspicions grow. This is why in an emergency they evacuate women and children first, so men can stay behind and work to solve the problem without drama. Ever more suspicious, Galadriel sends her pet Vulcan down to the catacombs to investigate Halbrand's family history. Just like a woman to be digging up dirt on a dude's past during a crisis. Also, don't ask me why a city populated entirely by immortal beings has catacombs in the first place. Anyway, shortly thereafter, Galadriel finds out the truth about Halbrand's past, and then we get one of the better scenes from the series so far.
I told you I found this on a dead man.
No, on the raft, you saved me.
On the raft? You saved me.
You convinced Miriel to save the men of Middle-earth.
You convinced her. I wanted to remain in Numenor.
You fought beside me.
Against your enemy. And mine.
As we get the big reveal, we see that Galadriel has been a fool, blinded by her ambition. She saw what she wanted to see and was oblivious to the reality around her. I know in the past that I've criticized the utterly mediocre writing of this show, but if the writers did make one good decision, it was not making Galadriel a Mary Sue. Because of some outside issues surrounding the show, largely of the show's own making, people have become overly emotionally invested in either glorifying the series or denigrating it. Oftentimes, both sides being blinded by their own self-interest, in my opinion. My point being that those who have set themselves against the show often accuse Galadriel of being a Mary Sue, but the facts simply don't support that accusation. She's unlikable, arrogant, petulant. Really, the only thing she is good at is killing orcs and spewing the most cringe dialogue you've ever heard. In fact, immediately following this scene, Sauron overpowers her physically and dominates her will. Yes, this is a poorly written show, but that just means there's plenty to criticize without having to make things up. Okay, rant over, let's move on. Now that she knows Halbrand is Sauron, Galadriel immediately tries to kill him, but he dominates her will and begins crawling within her mind. Sauron uses this opportunity to suggest they should rule together. She will bind him to the light, he will bind her to power. However, Galadriel begins to show herself for the woman that we know her to be. She's simply too wise and too strong to fall for his manipulations and rejects his overtures. Realizing he can't control Galadriel, Sauron tosses her into the river and uses this opportunity to make his escape to Mordor. When Galadriel then returns to Elrond and Celebrimbor, we get more interesting insight into her character there as well. First, she's wise enough to help circumvent Sauron's plans by making 3 rings. Remember, 1 will corrupt, 2 will divide, but 3 will create balance. On the other hand, she's so prideful or maybe even ashamed that she can't admit the presence of Sauron and warn the others. Remember, she knows he's a shapeshifter. That's why she held the knife to Elrond's throat. So just saying beware of Halbrand is not only pointless, it's dangerously irresponsible. We also learn that in order to forge the rings, they need the materials from Galadriel's dagger. As the dagger was the last thing she has from her brother, and in turn, her brother's murder was what was fueling her obsession with revenge, this sets up an obvious transition scene where Galadriel has to give up the past in order to have a future. For me, it was kind of clever and a nice little twist I didn't see coming. I have a couple of thoughts to round out this storyline before we move on to the Harfoots. First, all Sauron had to do was keep his mouth shut and Celebrimbor fails. When Celebrimbor fails, the elves would have been forced to leave Middle-earth. When all of the elves are gone, so too is any chance to realistically resist Sauron in his conquering of Middle-earth. I can't say that this is a plot hole because it's clear that Sauron wanted to learn more from Celebrimbor, but it's hard to believe he would have turned his back on the opportunity to force the elves out of Middle-earth. Second, I opened the video talking about how Rings of Power feels like the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, where they have no concept of time or distance. The last scene we see is Sauron arriving at Mordor, presumably having walked that entire distance, which would take months. Not only does the viewer feel any of this scale, but I promise you when we return to the other storylines, months will not have passed. For instance, for all we know, Isildur is still trapped in the burning barn. As I said earlier, it's the little things that disconnect the viewer from the show and break the immersion. The Hobbit story starts out in awkward fashion. The 3 priestesses who've been tracking the stranger come upon him in the forest all alone. And instead of showing themselves and saying, "We're here to help, we come to serve," they instead inexplicably use their magic to trick him until he's nervous and defensive. I don't know why you would do this with anybody, especially Sauron, who's not exactly known for his sense of humor. As a result, the relationship between the stranger and the priestess start off on an awkward footing, and this will have deadly consequences. As far as the reveal itself, once again, it just didn't work. As usual, it felt awkward and manipulative, like it was put there just as a gimmick. At no time did I think this was actually Sauron, and I suspect even people less familiar with the story did either. Anyway, as the story continues, the priestess says they're from the land of Rhûn, and that's where you can see the stars the stranger's been looking for. Now, this is straight from the books. In the original source material, we know that several wizards actually did visit Rhûn. As the priestess begin to explain to the stranger who and what he is, he becomes, I guess you'd call it, emotional, and starts to lose control of his powers. At this point, the priestess decide to put him into a magical sleep until he can learn to control his powers. Of course, all this happens just in time for our Hobbit friends to see and presume the priestesses are up to no good. This leads to a confrontation between the stranger and the hobbits versus the priests. The priests are destroyed, and unfortunately, Sadok Burrow takes one to the chest. Obviously, I've truncated the story, but that's because I'm over it and I really don't want to talk about it anymore. However, there are a few things I'd like to highlight. First, the scene gave multiple strong inferences that the stranger is actually Gandalf. When he destroyed the priests, he used some form of magic involving moths, and he also told Nori to follow her nose. Both events directly referencing things Gandalf did in the Peter Jackson trilogies. Also, since they're headed to Rhûn, it's a dead giveaway that he is in fact a wizard. Second, who were these priests that they were wielding such powerful magic? In Tolkien's world, there weren't just people walking around casting spells. There had to be a reason why you'd have magical capabilities. Nor was it common to see overt magic like this used on such a frequent basis. And lastly, I'd like to talk about Sadok Burrows dying. I've made no secret I've disliked the fake Hobbit storyline from day one and hope in season 2 it's considerably diminished. That being said, the character amongst them I liked the most was Sadok Burrows, being played by Lenny Henry. Mr. Henry's skill as an entertainer clearly outshines those of his Hobbit castmates, particularly when it comes to the understanding of comedy in a scene. So as much as I'd like to see all the fake Hobbits go, I was saddened that he was the one they chose. Now let's take a look at what's going on in Numenor. We get an interesting tidbit straight out of the gate when Pharazôn is talking to the aspirant artists. When talking about death and mortality, he says this:
granting him the immortality in stone, that no man, not even a king, can attain in life.
As you can tell, the words were resonating with him even as he was saying that. In the books, it was his desire to achieve immortality which made him susceptible to Sauron's manipulation. As Arwen is sitting with the king and taking his likeness, the king wakes up in almost a fever dream. He's so compromised he mistakes her for his daughter Miriel. He then speaks the prophecy that if the Númenóreans don't change their ways, their island will fall, and then tells Arwen to go and consult the Seeing Stone. Now, Arwen is a completely new and made-up character. In fact, she's a gender-swapped version of Isildur's actual brother. As she's not in the books, there's no way to really know which way the story's about to go. However, as she was likely gender-swapped specifically to meet Amazon's rules about the number of female cast members, it's a safe bet this is going to be used as a tipping point for her to get more screen time. About the same time Arwen discovers the Palantiri, we also see that the Númenórean expedition to the Southland has returned home. Miriel and Elendil discover the Path of the Faithful. This is going to be the faction that rejects Sauron's manipulation, rejects the worship of Morgoth, and flees Numenor before it is returned to the sea. As the discussion of the Path of the Faithful ends, the Númenórean ships sail into the harbor, and we get the big reveal of all of the black banners, signifying the death of the king. This should have been a benchmark scene, something where we look back and say, okay, from this point forward, we're going to see a significant change in the direction of the story. However, as usual, the show missed its mark. The scene was overdone and drawn out way too long to create some false sense of tension that never materialized. Well guys, that's it for me this week. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like or subscribe buttons, and I will see you next time.